A mafia boss pays a homeless woman to have his heir, but what happened after the birth would shatter everything he thought he knew about power and control. Rosaline took a chance on Pablo when she had every reason not to. I'm asking you to take a chance on me. Subscribe to this channel so we can go on this emotional journey together. Trust me, you won't regret it. Pablo Santoro was a 34-year-old man who commanded the criminal empire of the city's southern territories with a reputation that made grown men tremble. He had everything: wealth beyond measure, power that could topple governments, an army of loyal soldiers, and a name that echoed fear through every dark alley and boardroom alike. But that rainy night, as he drove through the city's forgotten streets in his black Mercedes, watching the neon lights blur against his windshield, he confronted a truth that had been gnawing at him for months. Despite the fortress he had built around himself, there was one critical vulnerability threatening to tear it all down. He had no heir. He needed a child to secure the Santoro bloodline and silence the whispers among his enemies that his empire would crumble the moment he fell. But Pablo didn't want a family in the conventional sense. He had loved once, fiercely and completely. Her name had been Gabriela, not a lover, but his younger sister, the only person who had ever seen past the monster he'd become. When she was murdered at 16 by the Cortez family, caught in the crossfire of a territorial war, something inside Pablo died with her. The tattoo creeping up his neck was a permanent memorial to that night, inked over his heart's gravesite. He learned then that love was a liability, a crack in the armor that enemies could exploit. It only brought devastation. But a child was different. It wasn't about emotion or weakness, it was about legacy, about ensuring that everything he had built through blood and ruthlessness wouldn't disappear into nothing. It was a strategic investment in the empire's future, a guarantee that the Santoro name would endure long after his enemies finally caught up with him. And he was resolved not to complicate this with romance or partnership. He needed a straightforward transaction, without emotional entanglements, without vulnerability, just a contract, cold and binding as steel. That's when he saw her. Rosaline sat on the rain-soaked curb, her tattered red dress clinging to her thin frame, her long dark hair plastered against her face. She was clutching herself against the cold, and even from his car, Pablo could see the fresh bruises on her arms, the cut above her eyebrow, the absolute emptiness in her eyes. She looked utterly broken, a woman with nothing left to lose, which made her, in Pablo's calculating mind, absolutely perfect for what he needed. He pulled his Mercedes to the curb, the engine purring like a predator. As he stepped out, adjusting his suit jacket against the rain, their eyes met. In that moment, something passed between them, not connection, not yet, but recognition. Two shattered souls, each carrying wounds too deep to heal, each believing they had nothing left worth protecting. Pablo approached her slowly, his expensive shoes splashing through puddles. "You look like someone who's run out of options," he said, his voice cutting through the sound of rain. It wasn't cruel, just factual, the observation of a man who had learned to read desperation like others read books. Rosaline looked up at him, this man in his tailored suit who radiated danger and power, and something flickered in her exhausted eyes. Not hope, hope had abandoned her long ago, but curiosity, maybe recognition that this stranger saw exactly what she was, nothing. "I have a proposition for you," Pablo continued, crouching down to her level, his dark eyes studying her face with the same intensity he used to evaluate business deals. $200,000, a place to live, medical care, security. All you have to do is carry my child. 9 months, a clean medical procedure, no complications. When it's over, you walk away with enough money to start whatever life you want, anywhere you want. He paused, letting the offer sink in, watching her process the magnitude of what he was suggesting. "I don't want a relationship. I don't want emotional complications. I want an heir, and you need a way out of whatever hell you're living in. This is business, pure and simple. A contract, nothing more." Rosaline stared at him, at this stranger offering her a lifeline that felt more like a noose. She thought about the eviction notice crumpled in her pocket, about the loan sharks who had promised to break more than just her ribs next time, about her ex-husband Jared's fists, and his voice telling her she was worthless, that no one would ever want her. She thought about the fact that she had eaten nothing but convenience store scraps for 3 days, that she had nowhere to sleep tonight except this cold curb. What did she have to lose that had already been taken from her? "Why me?" she asked, her voice hoarse from disuse and rain. Pablo's expression didn't change, but something almost resembling honesty crept into his tone. "Because you have nothing, no family to ask questions, no attachments to complicate things, no expectations that I can disappoint. You're exactly what I need, someone who understands this is just a transaction." The rain continued to fall as they stared at each other, two people about to make a deal that would change both their lives in ways neither could possibly imagine. Pablo didn't know that this cold, emotionless arrangement would crack open his carefully constructed walls, and Rosaline didn't know that accepting his offer would eventually teach her that she was worth so much more than survival. But in that moment, on that rain-soaked street corner, all they saw was an escape, him from vulnerability, her from despair. Sometimes the most profound transformations begin with the simplest word. Rosaline took a shaky breath, looked into the eyes of this dangerous stranger, and whispered the word that would set everything in motion. Yes. The guest house sat at the edge of Pablo's estate like an afterthought, a small cottage deliberately positioned 300 yards from the main mansion. It wasn't cruelty that dictated the distance, it was strategy. Pablo wanted separation, clean boundaries between the transaction and his life. When Rosaline first stepped inside, carrying nothing but a plastic bag with her few belongings, she found the space already furnished, a bed with crisp white sheets, a small kitchen stocked with basics, and windows that overlooked manicured gardens she'd never imagined existing in the same world as the street corner where they'd met. Pablo laid out the rules that first night, standing in her doorway like he was afraid to cross the threshold. Weekly medical checkups at a private clinic, no questions about his business, ever, no expectations beyond what is written in the contract she signed with trembling hands. His voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of a man reading terms and conditions. When he finished, he simply nodded and left, his footsteps fading into the darkness between her cottage and his fortress. The procedure happened within days at an exclusive clinic where the staff moved with practiced silence and averted eyes. The doctor, a woman in her 50s with kind hands and a mouth trained not to ask questions, performed the procedure with clinical precision. Pablo had paid her handsomely for discretion, that much was obvious. 3 weeks later, that same doctor confirmed what Rosaline already suspected from the nausea and exhaustion. She was pregnant. The words hung in the sterile air between them, and Rosaline placed a hand on her still flat stomach, feeling the weight of a future she couldn't yet comprehend. Days blurred into weeks, and Rosaline settled into a strange existence suspended between two worlds. She watched Pablo's life from a distance, like observing a documentary about a species she didn't understand. Black cars arrived at all hours, depositing men in expensive suits whose eyes held violence barely contained beneath polished exteriors. She'd see Pablo through the mansion windows during these meetings, his posture rigid, his gestures sharp and commanding. The tension lived in his shoulders, a permanent burden he carried like Atlas holding up a criminal empire. She never saw him smile, not once. She began keeping a journal, partly because the isolation was suffocating, partly because she needed to make sense of what she was doing. But the entries quickly transformed into something else, letters to the baby growing inside her. "Dear little one," she wrote on day 37, "I wonder what kind of world I'm bringing you into. Your father is a stranger to me, a man who built walls so high around himself that I'm not sure there's anyone left inside them. But you're real, you're mine, and somehow that has to be enough." Pablo, meanwhile, summoned his head of security to his office one evening, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey as Franco stood waiting. "Watch over her," Pablo instructed, his back turned as he stared out at the estate. "But maintain distance. She doesn't need a friend, she needs protection." Franco nodded, understanding what wasn't being said. When the man left, Pablo added quietly, almost to himself, "She's an investment, nothing more." But late at night, alone in his office, Pablo found himself pulling up the security feeds. He'd tell himself it was routine monitoring, just ensuring his investment was secure. Yet his eyes would linger on the screen showing Rosaline walking through his gardens in the afternoon sun, one hand unconsciously resting on her growing belly, her face turned toward flowers she'd stopped to admire. He didn't understand why he kept watching, why something in his chest tightened when he saw her smile at a butterfly that landed on her finger. He'd built these walls for protection, brick by brick, loss by loss. What he didn't realize, what neither of them realized yet, was that sometimes the walls we build to keep pain out also trap us inside, alone in the dark, unable to see the light that's been waiting just beyond our self-imposed prison. 3 months into the pregnancy, Rosaline woke at 2 a.m. with her stomach churning violently. She barely made it to the bathroom before her body rebelled, wave after wave of nausea leaving her weak and shaking. The morning sickness had been bad before, but this was different, relentless, draining, until she couldn't stand anymore. She collapsed against the cold tile floor, her vision blurring, her mouth dry as sandpaper. The last thing she remembered before darkness took her was thinking how pathetic it would be to die alone on a bathroom floor, carrying a stranger's child. Pablo heard the sounds from his study where he'd been reviewing accounts. Something made him look up, made him listen. The guest house was too far away for noise to carry, but he'd installed audio monitors for security purposes, he told himself. The thud of her body hitting the floor cut through the speakers like a gunshot. He was moving before conscious thought caught up, sprinting across the estate grounds in his shirt sleeves, not bothering with his jacket or gun. When he found her, she was unconscious, her skin pale and clammy, her breathing shallow. Every instinct screamed to call his staff, to maintain the distance, to let professionals handle this investment. Instead, his hands were already sliding under her, lifting her limp body against his chest. She weighed nothing, felt fragile as glass in his arms. He carried her into his mansion, through corridors no one but his inner circle ever walked, and laid her in a bedroom that had stood empty for years, the room he'd once imagined would be Gabriella's when she got older. He sat beside the bed, his hand unconsciously resting near hers on the white sheets, and waited for the doctor to arrive. When Rosaline's eyes finally fluttered open, there was something in his expression, raw, unguarded concern, that vanished the instant he noticed her noticing. His mask slammed back into place so fast she wondered if she'd imagined it. "You're dehydrated. The doctor's on the way." But something had shifted between them in that moment, a hairline crack in the foundation of their arrangement. Pablo started joining her for dinner after that, appearing in the guest house with takeout containers and the excuse that he needed to monitor the baby's progress. Their conversations limped along awkwardly at first. Rosaline would talk about the books she was reading, philosophy, poetry, novels about people living lives nothing like theirs. Pablo would respond with clipped observations about his legitimate business ventures, the restaurants and real estate holdings that provided cover for his true empire. But slowly, carefully, they began to learn each other's rhythms. One evening, Rosaline noticed a faint scar cutting through Pablo's left eyebrow, almost hidden by the way his hair fell. "How did you get that?" she asked, her voice soft, with genuine curiosity, not interrogation. Pablo's hand moved toward his face, then stopped. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, memory, pain, the ghost of a boy he used to be. He almost answered honestly. The words were right there, waiting to be spoken. Then his jaw tightened and the walls slammed shut again. "Old business," he said, his tone closing the door. "Doesn't matter."
But it did matter, and they both knew it. The real crack came 2 weeks later. Rosaline was reading on the couch when she felt it, a flutter, then a distinct push against her palm. Her breath caught. "Oh," she gasped, and without thinking, without planning, she reached out and grabbed Pablo's hand from where he sat across from her. She pressed his palm flat against her belly, holding it there with both of hers. Pablo froze completely, every muscle in his body going rigid. Then he felt it, the tiny kick, the undeniable proof of life moving beneath his hand. His child, his daughter, though he didn't know that yet. The sensation hit him like a physical blow, and something in his chest cracked open, a pain so sharp and unexpected that he couldn't breathe. It was the same tightness he'd felt the night Gabriella died in his arms, but inverted, not loss, but the terrifying, overwhelming weight of having something to lose again. He sat there, his hand trapped under Rosaline's, feeling his unborn child move, and understood with sudden clarity that he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. This was never going to be just business. He'd thought he could protect himself by building walls, by keeping distance, by calling this an investment rather than what it really was. But healing doesn't work that way. Sometimes the only way forward is to let someone see you break, to let them witness the cracks and trust they won't use them to destroy you. Pablo didn't pull his hand away, and in that small act of surrender, everything began to change. Antonio, the butcher, Ruiz, sat at the head of a table in his warehouse compound, studying surveillance photos before him like a winning hand of cards. The images showed a pregnant woman with long dark hair walking through gardens, entering medical clinics, living in a guest house on Pablo Santoro's estate. A scarred finger tapped the photograph thoughtfully, and a slow smile crept across Antonio's face, the kind of smile that made even his own men uncomfortable. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth as poisoned honey, "it appears our untouchable friend has finally developed a weakness." He held up the photo of Rosaline, her hand resting on her swollen belly. "Pablo Santoro has always been impossible to hurt because he's had nothing to lose, no family, no attachments, just his empire and his pride." Antonio's smile widened. "Now, though," he said, "now he's got a pregnant woman carrying his heir. Perfect timing." He instructed his surveillance team to track Rosaline's movements, particularly her medical appointments at the private clinic. Black sedans began appearing in places they shouldn't, always just far enough away to seem coincidental. Men in noticeable clothing photographed her from across streets, documenting her routines, her vulnerabilities, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Pablo's security noticed the vehicles. Franco reported the suspicious activity during their weekly briefing, his weathered face creased with concern. "Boss, we've spotted the same cars 3 times now. Different plates each time, but the pattern is clear. Someone's watching the estate." But Pablo, for perhaps the first time in his career, let his guard slip. Not because he was careless, because he was distracted by something he'd never experienced before. The quiet contentment of coming home to someone who made the mansion feel less like a fortress and more like a place where life happened.
He'd started bringing Rosaline her favorite foods without being asked. Fresh strawberries from the farmer's market, the specific brand of tea she'd mentioned once in passing, pastries from a bakery she'd described from her childhood. He remembered small details she shared during their dinners, filed them away like they mattered, because somehow they did. One afternoon, he appeared at the guest house with a shopping bag, his expression almost sheepish. "For you," he said, and inside was a red dress. Beautiful, elegant, nothing like the tattered one she'd been wearing that rainy night. Not tattered this time, he added, and something that almost resembled a smile ghosted across his face. Rosaline was discovering the man hidden beneath the monster everyone else saw. She'd catch him in the early mornings, feeding the stray cats that wandered his gardens, speaking softly to them in Spanish, his entire demeanor gentle in a way that contradicted everything his reputation promised. Every Sunday at exactly 10 a.m., she'd hear him on the phone, his voice warm and patient as he talked to Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who'd raised him after his parents died. Yes, I'm eating properly. No, I haven't forgotten your birthday. I love you too. And late at night, when insomnia clawed at him, piano music would drift from his study. Melancholy, haunting melodies played by hands that also pulled triggers, expressing emotions he couldn't speak aloud. But while they built something fragile and unexpected between them, the shadows were closing in. Franco tried again, more insistent this time. Boss, these aren't random surveillance vehicles. This is coordinated, professional. We need to increase security, particularly around Rosaline's medical appointments. I'm worried. Pablo cut him off with a wave of his hand, his confidence bordering on arrogance. Ruiz knows better than to touch what's mine, Franco. He's survived this long because he understands boundaries. He's probably just gathering intelligence, trying to find leverage for negotiations. It's posturing, nothing more. Franco wanted to argue, wanted to press the issue, but he recognized the look in Pablo's eyes. His boss had been untouchable for so long, had built an empire so formidable that threats seemed impossible. Pride had calcified into certainty, and certainty had made him blind. Yes, boss, Franco said quietly, though every instinct screamed that they were missing something critical. In his warehouse across the city, Antonio studied updated surveillance reports and smiled that terrible smile again. She's 7 months along now, he told his men. Soon, very soon, we'll show Pablo Santoro what happens when gods forget they're mortal. We'll take from him what he's finally allowed himself to care about, and we'll watch his empire crumble from the inside out. Pride had always been Pablo's armor, his unshakable belief that he was untouchable, that his reputation alone was sufficient protection. But pride, as any ancient story will tell you, comes before the fall, and sometimes, by the time we see the cliff's edge, we're already tumbling over it, reaching desperately for what we should have protected all along. The clinic appointment was routine. Just another checkup at 7 months, measuring the baby's growth, listening to the heartbeat that had become Rosaline's favorite sound in the world. Pablo had wanted to come, had actually cleared his schedule, but a crisis with a shipment demanded his immediate attention. Take 2 guards, he'd told her that morning, kissing her forehead in a gesture that had become natural between them. I'll see you when you get back. She never made it back. Antonio's team struck with military precision, a coordinated assault that left no room for error. 6 armed men stormed the clinic's entrance just as Rosaline was leaving, their movements synchronized like a dance they'd rehearsed 100 times. Pablo's bodyguards reached for their weapons, but the tranquilizer darts hit them first, silent, efficient, designed to neutralize without the noise of gunfire that would bring police. They dropped like puppets with cut strings. Rosaline screamed, her hands instinctively protecting her swollen belly as rough hands grabbed her arms. She fought despite the pregnancy, kicking, biting, her terror giving her a strength she didn't know she possessed. But there were too many of them, and they dragged her toward a black van with its engine already running. The last thing she saw before a hood was thrown over her head was the receptionist's horrified face through the clinic window. They took her to an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district, all broken windows and rusted metal, the kind of place where screams wouldn't carry beyond the walls. When they removed the hood, Antonio Ruiz was standing before her, his scarred face twisted into something that might have been a smile on a different man. Pablo was in a meeting with his financial advisors when his phone rang, Franco's name on the screen. He almost didn't answer. Franco knew not to interrupt unless it was critical, but something made him pick up. She's gone, boss. Franco's voice was tight with controlled panic. Ruiz took her. The words hit Pablo like a bullet to the chest. The room around him seemed to tilt, all the air sucked out in an instant. His carefully constructed control, 15 years of emotional discipline, of never letting anything touch him, evaporated like smoke. The phone slipped from his hand, clattering on the mahogany table, and everyone in the room saw something they'd never witnessed before, Pablo Santoro shattering. He didn't think about strategy or caution or the careful chess game of Mafia politics. He thought only of Rosaline, her laugh when he brought her strawberries, the way she hummed while reading, how she'd started sleeping in his bed because she felt safer there, the life growing inside her that he'd felt kick against his palm. His daughter. His family. Get everyone, he said, his voice deadly calm in a way that made his men more afraid than if he'd been screaming.
Within an hour, Pablo had mobilized his entire organization. He called allies in rival families, offered truces to enemies, promised anything to anyone who could help locate the warehouse. His network of informants spread through the city like a virus, asking questions, following leads, squeezing information from anyone who might know where Antonio would take a hostage. In the warehouse, Antonio circled Rosaline like a predator, explaining his plan with the casual cruelty of a man who enjoyed watching things break. "Your baby will never be born," he said, his voice echoing in the empty space, "and Pablo will be broken, the great Santoro brought to his knees by losing what he finally allowed himself to care about. It's almost poetic." Rosaline was terrified, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst, but something else was building inside her, a fierce, primal rage. This man wanted to hurt her baby, wanted to use her to destroy Pablo, and she would die before she let that happen. She spat into Antonio's face. "You think you're hurting him?" she said, her voice shaking but defiant. "You're just proving you're terrified of him. You know Pablo will come for me. You know he'll burn this entire city down to find me, and when he does, nothing will save you." Antonio's hand cracked across her face, the force of it snapping her head to the side. She tasted blood, felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but she wrapped her arms around her belly protectively and whispered promises to the life inside her. "Your father will come," she murmured over and over like a prayer. "I know he will. He loves us. He'll come." True courage isn't the absence of fear, it's loving something so much that you'll face any terror to protect it. Rosaline was afraid, more afraid than she'd ever been, but she was a mother, and mothers, when pushed to the edge, become forces of nature that no amount of cruelty can break. Pablo arrived at the warehouse with 30 armed men, an arsenal of weapons, and absolutely nothing left to lose. This wasn't the careful, calculated mafia operation he built his reputation on. This was a full-scale assault driven by desperation and a love he could no longer deny. When Franco tried to suggest a strategic approach, Pablo simply loaded his gun and said, "We go in now." The gunfire erupted like thunder, shattering the warehouse's eerie silence. Pablo moved through the chaos like a man possessed, like vengeance given human form. His suit was splattered with blood that wasn't his hands steady as they'd always been, but inside his chest, something was screaming her name over and over. He found her in the warehouse's back corner, chained to a support beam, her red dress torn and filthy, blood trickling from a cut above her eye. Her pregnant belly rose and fell with shallow breaths. When their eyes met across the smoky, bullet-riddled space, something fundamental shifted in Pablo's understanding of himself. He didn't see an investment, he didn't see the mother of his heir or a business arrangement or any of the lies he'd told himself to maintain distance. He saw Rosaline, the woman who hummed while reading, who wrote letters to their unborn daughter, who'd looked at the monster everyone feared and somehow found the man he'd buried 15 years ago. He saw the woman he loved, and that realization hit him harder than any bullet ever could. "I'm here," he whispered, dropping to his knees beside her, his hands shaking as they worked the chain's locks. His voice cracked on the words, all his carefully constructed control disintegrating. Rosaline collapsed into his arms, and Pablo Santoro, who'd never cried since the night his sister died, who'd built an empire on the foundation of never feeling anything, broke completely. Tears streamed down his face as he held her, this precious, fragile life he'd almost lost because of his arrogance. He pressed his face into her hair, his body shaking with sobs he'd suppressed for 15 years, and whispered apologies between gasping breaths. Across the warehouse, Antonio Ruiz tried to escape through a side exit, thinking the chaos would cover his retreat, but Pablo saw him. Gently, so gently, he laid Rosaline down, told Franco to watch her, and moved after Antonio with the focused purpose of an executioner. He cornered Antonio in an alley behind the warehouse, his back against a brick wall, nowhere left to run. Antonio started to speak, to bargain or threaten or plead. Pablo would never know which, because he didn't care. He raised his gun, looked Antonio in the eyes, and said the only words that mattered. "You touched my family. There's no coming back from that." The gunshot echoed between the buildings, and
then there was silence. Pablo returned to Rosaline, scooped her into his arms despite Franco's offer to help, and carried her to his car himself. She trembled against his chest, going into shock, and he held her tighter, murmuring reassurances as he drove at dangerous speeds back to the mansion. "You're safe. I've got you. Nothing will hurt you again. I promise. I promise." The doctor confirmed what Pablo desperately needed to hear. The baby was unharmed, her heartbeat strong and steady. Rosaline needed rest, fluids, time to recover from the trauma. Pablo nodded mechanically, but he wasn't really listening. He was watching Rosaline's face, pale against the white pillows, and making silent vows to every god he didn't believe in. For 3 days, Pablo didn't leave her side. He sat in a chair pulled close to the bed, watching her sleep, holding her hand like it was the only thing anchoring him to earth. He didn't shower, barely ate, refused all business calls. Franco ran the organization in his absence, understanding without being told that something fundamental had changed in his boss. On the 3rd night, as Rosaline slept peacefully and moonlight spilled through the windows, Pablo finally allowed himself to acknowledge the truth he'd been running from since the moment he felt their daughter kick beneath his palm. He was in love with Rosaline Torres, completely, irrevocably, terrifyingly in love. Not because of the baby or the contract or any rational reason he could justify to himself. He loved her because she'd seen him, truly seen him, and hadn't turned away. Because she made him want to be more than the monster his reputation promised. Because when he'd thought he might lose her, nothing else in his entire empire had mattered. Love reveals itself most clearly not in candlelit dinners or perfect moments, but in the willingness to sacrifice everything, your safety, your reputation, your carefully constructed walls, for another person's survival. Pablo had built his life on never needing anyone, never caring enough to be vulnerable. But sitting beside Rosaline's bed, holding her hand while she healed from wounds he'd failed to prevent, he understood that love wasn't weakness. It was the only thing worth being strong for. Rosaline woke in the darkness of her 4th night of recovery, her body still aching but her mind finally clear. The bedroom was empty, but she noticed the balcony door slightly ajar, curtains stirring in the night breeze. Through the gap, she could see Pablo's silhouette against the star-filled sky, sitting motionless in one of the wrought iron chairs, staring upward like he was searching for answers written in constellations. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and joined him, the cool air raising goosebumps on her skin. He didn't turn when she approached, didn't acknowledge her presence, but she saw his jaw tighten. That tell she'd learned meant he was fighting some internal battle. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly, settling into the chair beside him. "Never could," he replied, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Not since I was 19. Rosaline looked at his profile, at the tension carved into his features, and asked the question she'd been holding since that rain-soaked night when he'd first offered her this impossible arrangement. "Why did you really want an heir, Pablo? The truth this time." For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and wounded inside him. "I had a sister," he said, still staring at the stars. "Gabriela. She was 16 when the Cortez family killed her, caught in crossfire during a territorial dispute that had nothing to do with her. She was just in the wrong place, and I was too weak to protect her." His voice cracked on the word weak, and Rosaline saw his hands tighten on the chair's armrests. "I held her while she died, right there in the street, her blood soaking into my clothes, and she looked at me and said, 'Don't let them win, Pablo. Don't let them destroy our family.' Those were her last words." Rosaline's heart ached for the boy he'd been, for the impossible weight of that promise. "I built this empire so no one could ever hurt my family again," Pablo continued, and now he did look at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I made myself powerful enough, feared enough that just my name would be protection. But in doing that, I had to close myself off completely. I had to believe that caring about anything, loving anyone, made you vulnerable, made you weak. I watched my parents crumble after Gabriella died, watched grief destroy them, and I swore I'd never let myself feel that way again. He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture of defeat she'd never seen from him. I thought if I had a child, an heir, I could fulfill my promise to Gabriella without the risk of actually loving again. It would be strategic, bloodline continuation, nothing more. His laugh was bitter, self-mocking. But then you happened, and the baby happened, and somewhere between that first dinner and feeling her kick, I fell in love with both of you. And now I don't know how to do this, Rosaline. I don't know how to let myself feel again after spending 15 years teaching myself not to. Rosaline reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his scarred knuckles. For a moment, they sat in silence, connected by touch and shared pain. My ex-husband, Jared, used to tell me I was worthless. Every day for 3 years. He'd gamble away our money, come home drunk, and tell me I was lucky he stayed, that no one else would ever want damaged goods like me. He'd hit me and then apologize and say it was my fault for making him angry. And the terrible thing, Pablo, was that I started to believe him. I thought I deserved the pain because I'd been told I was nothing for so long, that nothing was all I could see when I looked in the mirror. She felt Pablo's hand tighten around hers, protective even in this moment of vulnerability. When you found me on that street corner, I had convinced myself I didn't deserve better than survival, that being used for your heir was probably the best offer I'd ever get. She turned to face him fully, her eyes meeting his in the starlight. But I'm learning something, Pablo. We aren't what was done to us. We're not defined by Gabriella's death or Jared's abuse or any of the trauma that tried to break us. We're defined by what we choose to become despite it. Pablo looked at her like she'd just offered him salvation, like her words were a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. I choose to believe I'm worthy of love, and I choose to see you not as the monster you've convinced yourself you are, but as the man who feeds stray cats and calls his nanny every Sunday and cries when he holds me because he's finally letting himself feel again. They sat in silence after that, two broken people beginning to understand that healing doesn't mean forgetting the past. It means facing it honestly and choosing a different path forward. Together, hand in hand under the stars, they started to believe that maybe, just maybe, their shattered pieces could fit together into something whole. The final weeks of Rosaline's pregnancy brought a transformation so complete that Pablo barely recognized the man he'd become. He stopped pretending their arrangement was business, stopped maintaining the fiction that this was just a contract. The guest house stood empty now. Rosaline had moved into the mansion permanently, into his bedroom, into his life in ways he'd never imagined possible. He attended every medical appointment, sitting beside her on the exam table, asking the doctor questions he secretly researched online at 2 a.m. Is her iron level sufficient? Should we be concerned about the baby's position? What signs indicate we need to come to the hospital immediately? The doctor would smile knowingly, and Rosaline would squeeze his hand, amused by this version of Pablo Santoro that the criminal underworld would never recognize. They set up the nursery together in the room adjacent to his bedroom, the room that had once been Gabriella's in his imagination. Pablo was awkward at first, a man whose hands knew violence struggling to learn gentleness. He'd stand in the doorway holding a tiny onesie, looking completely lost, until Rosaline would guide him with patient humor. It goes over the head first, then the arms, she'd explain, demonstrating on the stuffed bear he'd bought, the first of many gifts that kept appearing, like he was trying to fill the nursery with proof that he could provide, that he could be what their daughter needed. They painted the nursery on a Saturday afternoon, Pablo in an old t-shirt Rosaline had never seen him wear, his usual armor of expensive suits abandoned. When she accidentally got pale yellow paint in his hair after reaching for the ceiling, he turned to protest and she saw it, a genuine laugh, unguarded and full, the sound of joy he'd forgotten he was capable of feeling.
She laughed with him, and for a moment they were just two people covered in paint building a home for their child. Pablo read parenting books in secret, hiding them under financial reports when anyone entered his office. He called Mrs. Chen for advice, his voice vulnerable in ways that made the elderly woman cry with happiness. "She's changing you, mijo. Your Gabriela would be so proud." He even practiced holding a doll, Franco walking in one afternoon and quickly backing out without comment, though Pablo caught the knowing smile.
But Rosaline was changing too, and that transformation was equally profound. She was no longer the terrified woman in the tattered red dress who'd accepted his offer because she had nothing left to lose. She stood taller now, her voice steady with newfound confidence. She spoke her mind, challenged him when he slipped into old patterns of control. One afternoon, Pablo tried to dictate her schedule, insisting she stay home because he'd heard rumors of increased police activity downtown. It was the old Pablo, the one who controlled everything and everyone. "I'm not your employee," Rosaline said, her voice firm but not unkind. "I'm the mother of your child, and I'm your partner. I deserve respect, not orders. If you're concerned about my safety, we discuss it and decide together." Pablo stopped mid-sentence, truly seeing her, not as someone who needed his protection, but as someone who deserved his partnership. The realization shifted something in his chest. "You're right," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." They were the hardest words he'd spoken in years, an apology to someone he'd wronged, an admission that he didn't have all the answers. But they were also liberating, this acknowledgement that he could be wrong and the world wouldn't collapse. As Rosaline's due date approached, fear crept in for both of them, not of labor or complications, but of what came after. Late at night, lying in bed with his hand on her belly, feeling their daughter's movements, Pablo would voice the terror he couldn't escape. "What if I'm not good at this? What if I mess her up the way my parents messed me up? What if all I know how to do is hurt people?" Rosaline would turn to face him in the darkness, her hand covering his. "Then you learn. We both learn. We're not going to be perfect parents, Pablo. We're just going to be present ones, loving ones. That's all any child really needs." But she had her own fears too. What if she looks at me one day and asks why I agreed to this arrangement? What if she thinks I'm the kind of mother who would sell herself for money? Pablo would pull her closer then, pressing his lips to her forehead. Then we tell her the truth, that two broken people found each other in the darkness and built something beautiful despite everything trying to tear them apart. We tell her that love doesn't always start perfectly, but what matters is where it leads. Real love transforms us, not by erasing who we were. Pablo would always carry the scars of his past. Rosaline would always remember the woman she'd been on that street corner, but by inspiring us to become better versions of ourselves. They weren't the same people who'd signed that contract. They'd been reshaped by vulnerability, by choosing each other every day, by learning that strength wasn't about walls, but about the courage to let someone in. Rosaline's water broke at 3 a.m., 2 weeks before her due date, soaking through the sheets and waking them both with a jolt. For a moment, they stared at each other in the darkness, and then Pablo exploded into action. He was beside himself with panic, barking orders at his staff over the phone, throwing on clothes, grabbing the hospital bag they'd packed weeks ago in preparation. His hands shook as he helped Rosaline down the stairs, and she found herself being the calm one despite the contractions already beginning to grip her belly. "Pablo, slow down," she said, as he drove toward the hospital at speeds that would have gotten anyone else arrested. "We have time. The baby's not coming in the next 5 minutes." "You don't know that," he said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes wild with fear. "What if something goes wrong? What if we don't make it in time?" She reached over and placed her hand on his thigh. "Then we'll handle it, together. But right now, I need you to breathe, because if you pass out from panic, you're not going to be much help." He laughed despite himself, a sharp exhale that released some of the tension and slowed down marginally.
In the delivery room, Pablo refused to leave her side. He held her hand through every contraction, his face a mask of helpless anguish every time she cried out in pain. He coached her breathing the way they'd practiced in those classes he'd initially mocked, his voice steady even as his heart hammered in his chest. Between contractions, he'd whisper to her, telling her she was the strongest person he'd ever known, that she was doing amazingly, that he was in awe of her. 12 hours later, after an eternity of pain and pushing and sweat and tears, their daughter entered the world with a cry that cut through the room like a declaration of arrival. The nurse cleaned her quickly and placed the tiny, squirming bundle in Pablo's arms. He broke down completely. Tears streamed down his face as he stared at this perfect, impossibly small human with dark hair plastered to her head and eyes that would later reveal themselves to be her mother's warm brown. His entire body shook with sobs he couldn't control, 15 years of suppressed emotion pouring out in a flood he had no defenses against. "Gabriella," he whispered through his tears, his voice breaking on every syllable. "Her name is Gabriella." Rosaline, exhausted and glowing with the fierce pride of what she'd just accomplished, reached up to touch his face. Her fingers traced the tears on his cheeks, and she smiled with a depth of contentment she'd never known existed. "She's beautiful. She's perfect." That night, after Rosaline and baby Gabriella were both resting peacefully, Pablo slipped away from the hospital room. He drove back to the mansion in the pre-dawn darkness, went directly to his safe, and retrieved the contract, that document that started everything, with its cold terms and clinical language about medical procedures and payment schedules. He returned to the hospital and stood in Rosaline's room while she slept, the contract in his hands, looking at the woman who had changed his entire world. Then he walked to the small sink in the corner, pulled out his lighter, and set the paper to fire. The contract curled and blackened, edges glowing orange before disintegrating into ash. He watched it burn completely, every word of their original arrangement consumed by flame, until nothing remained but gray powder that he washed down the drain. Rosaline stirred, waking to find him standing there, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the hospital room lights. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice thick with exhaustion. Pablo moved to her bedside, and she saw that his eyes were red, that he'd been crying again. He took her hand in both of his, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I don't want a business arrangement. I don't want an heir born from a transaction. I don't want any of what that contract represented, the distance, the pretense, the lie that this was ever just about bloodline and legacy."
6 months later, on a perfect spring afternoon, Pablo and Rosaline married in the garden where she'd once walked alone, writing letters to an unborn child and wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. Now those same gardens had been transformed into something magical. White chairs arranged in neat rows, flowers blooming in every direction, sunlight filtering through the trees like a blessing. The guest list was small, intimate. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, crying happy tears for the boy she'd raised who had finally found his way home to himself. Franco stood beside Pablo as best man, still adjusting to seeing his boss smile so freely, so often, like joy was now his default setting instead of that cold mask of control. A handful of Pablo's most trusted men attended, witnesses to a transformation they'd never thought possible. Rosaline emerged from the mansion carrying baby Gabriella on her hip, wearing a red dress that took Pablo's breath away. Not the tattered, desperate red of that rainy night, but a beautiful, elegant crimson that symbolized everything she'd become: strong, confident, radiant with the knowledge of her own worth. The baby cooed contentedly, her tiny hand wrapped around her mother's finger, oblivious to the significance of the moment. Pablo's eyes shone with tears as his family approached down the aisle, not just the woman he was about to marry, but his daughter,
his entire world contained in two people who had taught him that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that love wasn't liability, that opening your heart was the bravest thing a person could do. They stood facing each other under an arch woven with white roses, and when it came time for vows, Pablo's voice was steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Rosaline, I promise to love you not just today, but every day after. I promise to spend the rest of my life proving that people can change, that even the coldest hearts can thaw when love breaks through. I promise to be worthy of the second chance you've given me, to be the man our daughter can look up to, and to never forget that the greatest power I'll ever have is the power to choose love over fear." Rosaline smiled through her tears, Gabriella nestled against her chest, and spoke her own vows with a voice that carried the weight of everything they'd survived together. "Pablo, I promise to love you in your darkness and your light. I promise to remind you of your humanity whenever the weight of your world threatens to consume you, to be your anchor when the storms come, and to stand beside you as your partner, not behind you as someone you protect. I promise to build a life with you where our daughter learns that love is the strongest force in the universe, and that family isn't defined by how it begins, but by how fiercely we choose each other every single day." The officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and when they kissed, baby Gabriella squealed with delight, making everyone laugh. The sound of applause filled the garden, and for a moment, everything was perfect. Not because their lives would be easy from here, but because they'd learned that together they could face anything. Pablo's world was still dangerous. There would be rivals to contend with, threats to navigate, the constant tension of living on the edge of legality. But they'd also learned that love didn't make you weak. It gave you something worth fighting for, worth being better for, worth transforming yourself for.
As the afternoon turned to evening and guests mingled in the garden, Pablo stood with his wife and daughter, watching the sun set over the estate that had once been just a fortress, but was now a home. Rosaline leaned into him, Gabriella sleeping peacefully in her arms, and whispered, "We did it! We actually did it!" "We did," Pablo agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. Two broken people who should never have worked somehow built something beautiful. From that rain-soaked street corner to this garden filled with love, their journey had been marked by pain and trauma and choices that could have destroyed them. But they'd chosen differently. They'd chosen to heal, to trust, to believe that their pasts didn't have to dictate their futures. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin in the darkest places, because it's only in darkness that we truly learn to appreciate the light. Second chances are real, not because we deserve them, but because we're brave enough to take them when they're offered. Transformation is possible, even for people who've convinced themselves they're beyond saving. And love, genuine, unconditional, fierce love, can heal even the most shattered hearts. Pablo Santoro and Rosaline Torres had learned this truth the hard way, through kidnappings and contracts and walls that took months to dismantle. But standing in their garden at sunset, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them, they understood that every painful step had been worth it. They'd found redemption in the most unexpected place, in each other's arms, and built a family from the ashes of who they used to be. And that, more than any empire or fortune or reputation, was the legacy worth leaving behind.